Good afternoon. My name is Wendy Goldberg. I'm the Executive Director of the TriFaith Initiative. Thank you for being here with us today. I'm so excited to have a conversation with Lucinda Mosher, who is a thought leader in the field of interreligious studies and someone who is quickly becoming a resource and a friend. And so thank you so much for agreeing to join us today. Lucinda, you were introduced to me by another good friend, Ellie Pierce, who's here today. Shout out to Ellie. And what I am coming to know is how rich the connections are within this conversation and how beautiful it is to have the opportunity for us via Zoom and in person, hopefully soon, to be able to connect with people and experience this betweenness that's spoken about in your book. And so although we are virtual today, I feel a great connection to all of the groundwork that you have laid for us at TriFaith, trying to be an experiment of interreligious experience. And so I'm so excited to talk to you today about this guidebook. Lucinda, in your words, tell us what you hope this audience knows about you. I know you have many friends here, but you have people who have never met you before. What in your CV should everyone know before we start this conversation today?
Wow. Well, first of all, thank you all for coming. This is quite fun for me. I love talking to people who are interested in a topic that is dear to my heart. What I usually say when I introduce myself is that I'm a Christian moral theologian in the Anglican tradition who focuses on multi-religious concerns. And I do that as an educator, a consultant, an author, an editor, all of those at a pretty high level. So if you know that much about me, you know that I'm multifaceted. The other thing that's cool to know is I'm a working musician. I have multiple degrees in music as well as in theology. So you know, this bivocational aspect of me is, I think, part of the model of what's possible. It isn't necessary to give up being one thing in order to embrace fully being something else as well. So that's that in a nutshell, that's who I am. But there's some unusualness about that because I work in this arena of interreligious studies, which usually is done by the parent field is religious studies, and the difference between theology and religious studies is often said to be the difference between examining religion as a thing that you're an outsider looking at, and a theologian is someone who actually embraces a particular religion and fully and practices it and teaches about it from the inside. And I do both. I am, you know, I hold a degree from the flagship seminary of the Episcopal Church, so that's my doctorate. And yet I have always, you know, before the doctoral work and since, taught in religious studies departments where this notion that there should be some sort of an ability to step outside one's tradition and look at everything that's going on is assumed. So in that way, my credentials, the doctoral work that informs the scholarly work I now do is definitely not the norm, but that's what makes me a sort of a fun expert to have around, I guess.
And particularly for those of you who are not familiar with the TriFaith Initiative, we are in Omaha, Nebraska. We are unique in the world in that we have co-located a church, a mosque, and a synagogue with an interfaith center with intention. We've been at this since really the idea was birthed after 9/11, but we wrote our first memorandum of understanding in 2006. And in 2020, in the middle of a pandemic, we completed our mission to co-locate and have created a new mission, which really is the underbelly of this companion guide that we're going to talk about today, in my opinion, because the idea of cultivating inclusive environments to create a place where we come into relationship with the religious other is so much of the questions that you ask, and the multiple authors of the book grapple with. Can you tell us a little bit about your connection to TriFaith? You know what? I forgot something really important. Happy birthday!
Thank you.
And we're how gracious of you to share a special time in your life with you, and I hope you health and strength, and a beautiful celebration of life.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't mind saying I turned 75 yesterday, and that makes me very definitely sort of an elder statesperson in this work. And thank you for remembering that. So my connection to TriFaith happened, Sierra and I were trying to remember exactly when. It was probably 2012 or 2013. At that point, the Episcopal Church was active in brainstorming the initiative, and Tim Anderson was the point person for that, and he invited me to Omaha to help with some of the brainstorming. So I was there for a few days. I preached to the nascent Episcopal congregation that was trying to be a part of this, and many of them then came to what we then called Hartford Seminary to participate in a week-long religious diversity leadership workshop that I was chairing. So I had that sort of hands-on opportunity to talk with people who were trying to make a really special idea real, and kept, ever since then, I have watched it. If there were no initiatives like the TriFaith Initiative, there'd be nothing for people like me to teach about. So thank you for having this brilliant idea, and thank you even more for continuing with it and pushing it forward, so that now there are these beautiful buildings, and there's program, there's a garden. It's really an amazing project. So that's my connection. I've been watching it ever since. I teach about it regularly whenever I need an example of interreligious collaboration. I bring up TriFaith Initiative.
So your new book comes out when?
We hope it's coming out June 1st. This is the COVID hiccup. It was supposed to have been out already, and the supply chain has gotten in the way of publications this winter and spring. Getting paper, getting the cardboard to make the hardcover, that's been an issue. So the release date has been changed several times. At the moment, it's still posted as July 1st, and the books may actually be available a little sooner, but that's what we're counting on. And so what I've got at this point is the printout, and as you can see, it's a lot of pages. It's over around 550 pages.
Yeah,
and
I'm very familiar. So I thank you for the reader's guide, copy. It was so the book is called The Georgetown Companion to Interreligious Studies. Let's start with the definition of interreligious studies. There's a lot of words matter, and you picked companion and interreligious very intentionally. Can you tell us about those two choices?
Yeah, I mean, the project was brought to me by the head of Georgetown University Press, with which I have a relationship that goes back quite a ways. And we talked about what would be the appropriate large book to have, and we settled on a companion to interreligious studies. And it could have been something else, but interreligious studies, how do I define it? I had to really wrestle with this and look at how other people in the field were defining it 2 or 3 years ago. And here's the working definition I decided on for not just myself, but offering it to my institution in hopes that other people will use it too. So I define it as an intersectional, integrative academic field that promotes deep understanding of worldviews different from one's own and cultivates the dynamic link between theory and practice as it engages in critical investigation of relations between people, whether individuals or groups, who orient around religion differently howsoever religion be defined. So in putting it that way, yes, that's really long, you have to read it. But in putting it that way, what I'm saying is we're not going to start by arguing about what religion is. We're going to assume there is such a thing. It's on the table. People define it different ways. Whatever that is, everybody has an orientation to it. And we're going to engage each other from that starting point. And that opens up a lot of conversations.
And companion, is there any specific reason why companion? And we're going to come back to interreligious. I have a lot more questions related to that. I just want to get the companion piece.
Yeah, I mean, so the possibilities were handbook, dictionary, companion, and encyclopedia. And I immediately ruled out encyclopedia, as I said to my colleague at the press. Mircea Eliade already put together a brilliant multi-volume encyclopedia. We're not competing with that, and handbooks tend to be, I wrote in the book that the companion genre is nothing if not flexible. A dictionary or an encyclopedia of interreligious studies would be required to present entries in alphabetical order. The topics would be single word or short phrase topics, but a companion comes from the root with bread. It should be nourishing. It should be something that feeds you, that helps you get to where you need to go. And so it can be comprehensive like a handbook, but it can be organized in a more creative way. The titles of the chapters can be creative and evocative. So in short, I just felt that companion was a more useful, more flexible, more exciting way to craft a multi-chapter volume on interreligious studies, which is itself a barrier-breaking kind of discipline.
Thank you. So how many contributors do you have in the book? How did you select those contributors? And kind of tell us a little bit about that process, because there's an incredible scope.
Yeah, it was an interesting process for me to be masterminding. There are 54 contributors, and they come from all over the world. They're in Scandinavia, England, Canada, United States, Africa, the Far East, Australia. There's expertise also. Some of them represent, they're working here in the US, but they have expertise in Brazil and other places around the world. So it's quite, I wanted it to be international. I wanted it to be varied in terms of kinds of skills people brought to the topics. So how did I go about that? The first thing I did was kind of make a list of kinds of scholars that I would want in such a book. And I decided not to put out a call for papers and take whomever came and then try to sort it out and maybe have to tell people they couldn't be in it. But rather, I very deliberately, one at a time, invited people into the book. I got 40 yeses before I got the first no. And that told me that this project was exactly something that needed to be, that people were ready for such a project and happy to be a part of it. Certain scholars told me, I am way too busy to write another chapter right now, but this is important. I will make time. And so there are some really significant scholars. There are also a couple of people who were doctoral students as they were invited into this, but I felt that what they were doing as doctoral students was so significant and interesting that they deserved to be a part of the ground floor of talking about how we do interreligious studies. So I invited them in as well. I wanted the arts represented because I feel strongly about the role of the arts in interreligious studies. And as I looked at other books on the topic so far, not that much mentioned, not ignored, but not overemphasized either. So I really made room for that. So I kept track. I was judging what I had in terms of various sorts of intersectional points, gender, ethnicity, geographical location, religious location, both in terms of practice and field of scholarship. What interdisciplinary intersection was made between religion and what else, those kinds of intersections, trying to just keep it interesting, keep it varied. And I got up to around the 40 participants mark, and realized, let's change that, about 40 chapters, because some of these were pairs of people. And then there were people that came to me and said, I've heard about the project, I really would love to be in. And then I had to weigh whether to expand past 40 chapters, and ultimately decided to go with 50 chapters. And so that's where I cut it off. That was, we didn't, among the original people who committed to contribute chapters, a few had to drop out as COVID reared its head. They in one case, person's institution just completely closed. That person therefore was out of work. Trying to get a chapter written was just not going to happen. That sort of thing COVID did to us, but it also opened up other possibilities. And it was during that flux of having to lose a few people, but then having the freedom to invite new people in, that it seemed logical to expand from 40 chapters to 50. One of the most interesting authors in the mix was deceased as we began, but his work was so significant that a colleague of his took his writings and created a chapter from it that is now part of the book. And so his scholarship is now published, and that just warms my heart tremendously that it didn't go to waste with his untimely death. It is available to people, and it is a wonderful chapter. And speaking of death, the thing that I celebrate the most is, given COVID, I am amazed. 54 participants, the 53 who were alive at the beginning, are still alive. We did not lose anybody to COVID. And to me, that is worth celebrating.
Yes. Thank you so much. What incredible scope that you've been able to cover. And who do you imagine to be the audience?
The audience is several-fold. Students, I will be assigning this book, and I'm not the only one. It is useful as a resource for students. It's a good textbook because there's so much that's, you can have a unit on interreligious leadership, and there are 4 or 5 chapters. You can have a unit in your course on dialogue, and there are 4 or 5 chapters. There's just lots of possibilities. It will be a resource to professors. It will be a resource to researchers who want to see, well, what's been said so far and what direction might I go that's different. And honestly, I think it will be readable by the general public, that it's, many of these chapters are written in a style that is engaging on a topic that's interesting beyond the academy. So I think it, yeah.
I would agree. And I think in some of the cases, and while it's academic in nature, it reads like a series of short stories or short teachings. And I found myself very much seeing the connections between the chapters and being able to look for those, but each one standing alone was way more engaging to read than I thought when I first saw how many pages it was. So it was certainly worth the time. Let's go back to a few more of those definitions before we dig into some of the particulars of the work. Interreligious versus interfaith versus multifaith. Can you tell us why we're having these conversations in the lane of work that we're doing, and where you see the difference between those words?
Yeah, there's great argument about whether interreligious and interfaith are two different things. Some people think they are, that interreligious is more the academic term, and interfaith has to do with practice and activism. Maybe so, but I just try to define those two terms and then put the definitions side by side. And you'll find people, you'll take this definition and you'll find some people saying this definition means exactly what I mean when I use the word interfaith. And somebody else takes that exact same phraseology and says, oh, but that's what I mean by interreligious. So it's very muddy with those two terms. And that's why some people put a slash between them and just use both all the time. Multi-faith, multi-religious has to do more with the context, that there's a lot of religions in the process. So when I talk about multi-faith concerns, which is or multi-religious concerns, I use both. I mean a lot of different religions concerns on the table at once, and so it's more about the context than the actual work and the position from where the work comes.
And how would theist versus non-theistic and enter this conversation?
Yeah, theists are people who believe that God is, and God is a part of a topic of conversation in the work we do. Non-theists, God is not a question. God is not an answer to a question they're asking. God is. There are religions such as Buddhism and Jainism where, unless somebody else brought up questions about God, God would not be part of the conversation at all. It's not a necessary answer to any question that they're asking, like, what is the meaning of life? Where did we come from and where we're going? What's been interesting to me is I've actually been turned away from conversations about potential employment with the line, oh, well, you're a theist. I try not to hire any of those. So, now that's illegal to say that to my face, but I also thought, probably we wouldn't want to work together anyhow, if that's how you feel about it. But it really is two different worldviews. The worldview that says that when we ask the question, where did we come from? Where are we going? What makes the world work? That God is is in the answers to those questions, and those worldviews where it just doesn't come up. It's not necessary.
So one step deeper in this conversation is, where is the place between interreligious studies and comparative theology?
Yeah, some people feel that comparative theology is quite a separate discipline. And some people feel it's a discipline that can be housed under the umbrella of interreligious studies. I do both. I have stepped into the arena of comparative theology quite deeply. And here's what I see as the difference. Comparative theology is an approach to doing theology, which is looking at questions of how we make meaning, what is our source of knowledge, and the kinds of questions that, what is the nature of the human being, and how does that relate to what is the divine human relationship all about, those kinds of questions. A comparative theologian does that within her own religion. So it presumes you embrace a religion if you're going to do comparative theology, but you also embrace deep study of a second religion, such that you can do a deep dive into that religion and look for answers to similar questions and come back out with insight that you then bring to your home religion. And that means an ongoing conversation between the religions takes place within your very being. For me, that is mostly my relationship to Islam, which I've been studying for about 30 years. And to a lesser extent, because it's more a recent pursuit, Hinduism. So I wade into both of those arenas. in the category of comparative theology is my work with the Building Bridges seminar, where I'm the editor of the books that initiative puts out. And so every year we take on a topic and study it deeply as a group of Christian scholars and Muslim scholars, and do a deep dive into whatever the topic is on the table for that year. And then all the material comes back to me and I massage it into a book. And those books are now filling up this bookshelf here. And that is the source of my connection to Georgetown University Press, because they've been publishing them lately.
Thank you. So I get that we're halfway into our hour and we're still talking about definitions. And one of the reasons that I stayed in this place and really care to hear what you have to say about these definitions, Lucinda, is that these are the questions that we're asking ourselves as people living among communities and experiencing, interacting with the religious other, and then asking ourselves as part of an experiment, what are the methods of interacting with each other academically, from a research perspective, from a programming perspective, from a human exchange? How should we turn our programs and our opportunities to look at the questions from all of these different angles, and deciding how we choose as an initiative to define the scope of our work. I want everyone who's on this call to understand there are so many questions within this field, and there's not one answer clearly there's not one answer to the big theological questions, but there's not even one answer to the strategies for which we might come about them. So I'm really interested in this Building Bridges initiative. There's a chapter on that in the book. That's Daniel Madigan's chapter, right?
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about kind of finding what communities are finding and looking at difference through scriptural reasoning and this bridge building initiative? Tell us a bit about it and this chapter in general.
Yeah, the scriptural reasoning is an initiative of its own and a method. Right. The Building Bridges seminars method is different, but
I'd like to know if you could explain the difference between those models.
Let me see if I can, because I'm not a participant in scriptural reasoning, but I've had many students who are, and an occasional colleague. And to me, in both cases, it's an agreement to study scripture together deeply. So in the case of scriptural reasoning, at least as it was founded, it was Jews, Christians, and Muslims studying scripture together. The Building Bridges seminar to this day is Christians and Muslims studying scripture, but also other texts together. So there you have a sharp difference, sticking with scripture on the one hand and taking scripture and tradition, the philosophical tradition, sometimes writings from even the scientific field, whatever it takes to address the topic in the other. So in both cases, it's dialogical, close reading of texts in order to discern insights from those texts, share them as best one can with people across the table whose religious commitments are different from your own. And to see in their scriptures something that is at least provocative to you, if not just downright beautiful, and so these really deep conversations, they're both methods. I think the scriptural reasoning is more of a lay method. Anybody can do it, and there's a lot that's been written about how to. So that definitely is a place to turn. The Building Bridges seminar method involves a curated conversation. Selected people are chosen to be at the table, and we spend a week together. And there are it's a lot of small group work that's conducted according to a pattern that has been established for we've been at this for 20 years. So it's a pattern that's well established. And the topics are topics like, what do we mean by prophecy? What do we mean by community? What do we mean by sin, forgiveness, and reconciliation? The list goes on. It's pretty complicated, and it can be replicated. You can try it at home, and we do. That's why we publish our lectures and our discussion resources as books, because we do hope people will read the books and say, wow, we could put together a conversation around this topic as well. One of my favorite ones is the very second one. It was Scriptures in Dialogue, where the question was, explain to everybody else what, who, where, why, with, what, where, why, with whom do you read scripture? What is scripture for you? With whom do you read it? When do you read it? How do you read it? Why? That's just answering those kinds of questions, even before you open the text itself and focus in on a passage that you want to share and compare. That's just a really amazing conversation. And I've used that with 7th grade boys, and I've used it with graduate students, and I've used it with everybody in between. So they're two good comparative dialogical methods, and I would encourage anybody with a circle of participants to that's willing to commit some time to it to try it. But in both cases, it only works well if you have a circle of people who are willing to commit to at least a few sessions together. It's not a one-off kind of experience. It's a at least 3 or 4 times together kind of experience.
So one of the phrases within that chapter that resonates with me and perhaps with everyone after the last 2 years is why is it important to allow others into our messy spaces?
Because it's humbling. It keeps us humble and honest.
Well, let's start with, what do you mean by messy spaces?
That messy spaces. Well,
what does he mean, do you think?
I think what he means. I'm looking at some notes I jotted down about what we've talked about with the seminar in the past, and one of the things that happens is that we've got Christians and Muslims together, and we are listening to each other, listening to God. We're listening to each other talk about our relationships to God. We're listening to each other argue about the meaning of our holy book, and not necessarily agreeing with our co-religionists about something. And we're doing that in front of people who are of the other religion. And might that not be embarrassing? And yet it's also real. And it shows the depth of the possibility in the text. And so it is messy because it's not always polite. It's mostly polite, but there are times when the conversation, just trying to get to clarity, is not all that easy. And that's how it is in the real world. So if we're going to have a dialogical project where we're trying to study and learn together, we ought to be willing to let it get messy. And we ought to also be willing to stick with it so that we can clean up the mess together, to continue to work on it till we come to some clarity. And again, I've been on the staff of the seminar since 2012, and I've watched this process. I participate. I do enter into the conversations, but I'm there mostly as a staff person, and I just find it really fascinating and wonderful that we are able to have these truly deep conversations over and over again. I hope that's helpful.
It is. I'm going to read one more line from this chapter that I really held, which was, the risk of theological dialogue is that it becomes a defense of our systems of discourse rather than an opening to the divine.
Yeah, and that is the risk. It's true. that we can all about be a defensive posture, and that we've got it all figured out. Rowan Williams, who was Archbishop of Canterbury for 10 years and a brilliant theologian, said that that if we take seriously this notion of being together, listening to each other, listening to God, what the outcome will be is the development of a virtuous circle rather than a vicious one. And so if we are willing to have, if we're willing to really listen and not just talk, then we can get beyond the defensiveness, and we can get to new understandings, a deeper place. And I hope we do that. I think we do.
Yeah, so that was one of the I don't know, aha moments for me is kind of that place in that chapter. What was an aha moment for you, or one or two or three from the collection?
Yeah, oh, there are many, but I think what I enjoy talking about is the way the last chapter came to be. This book is bookended by a chapter by me. I arrogated the first chapter to myself because the more I wrestled with how to have an introduction, should there be a preface and an introduction, we finally settled with help from many voices helping me sort out just how to get the book started and set up properly. We decided to have a preface, and we decided that I should write the first chapter. That chapter one really is establishing what I think the reader should know about the field. And so I got to chapter 50, and I said to my colleague Timur Yuskayev, I asked people to be willing to interrogate this field, to tear at it, and I'm not sure anybody really has done that, and I know you can. And so would you please take on the task of really looking at the whole of the book and writing a rebuttal if necessary, or writing a capstone, whatever it would take. And Timur readily said yes, and he also readily said, but I want to talk to you on the phone right now. And so what happened was that we ended up writing chapters 1 and 50 dialogically as two scholars who've known each other since about the year 2000. We both were New Yorkers. We taught together at St. Francis College. We both worked at the Interfaith Center of New York. And now we're both at what we now know as Hartford International University for Religion and Peace, or formerly Hartford Seminary. We're colleagues there and have been for years. So we have this intricate and long-standing relationship with each other as professionals. And we come at the word religion extremely differently. We come at many things differently, and yet we have great regard for each other. And so Timur dug into the field and critiqued many of the chapters and would pass it back to me, and I would critique his chapter and say, do you really want to say that? And he'd say, oops, maybe not. And then he'd retract, but meanwhile, I would fix my introductory chapter. And the end result is these two chapters talk to each other across the other 48 chapters. And I think that's unique. I don't know of another book that's got this kind of scope that was set up that way, where there really are true bookends.
So between those bookends, I just put in the chat for everyone. These are the sections that of the book. And can you talk through these sections a little bit?
Yeah.
And tell us, as an overview a little bit, why these sections, and maybe anything in particular that you learned from them.
Well, I had 50 essays, trying to figure out the best way to organize 50 essays so that it would be intuitive, so that people would find what they needed and just find the book useful. That was very important to me. And the topics that you see are not the first list I came up with. So the pieces got rearranged on my dining table quite a number of times. I settled on this list because for the most part, these are either characteristics that other people have said are true of interreligious studies as a field, or they are methodologies. So the first section, contours and concerns, that was a chance to invite several people besides myself to write about how did we get here? What is this field? Define the field. What are the characteristics of interreligious studies? What are the methods? Speak to that. That was a starting point. Then we could move into them one by one. So interdisciplinarity, the notion that we're studying religion and ethnography, or religion through ethnography, or history, or what are some of the others that are in there? Ecology, a fascinating chapter on ecology and religion, and it as an interreligious studies topic. So intersectionality, we had interdisciplinarity, intersectionality, everything that you may have heard about intersectionality as being the multiple parts of ourselves that we bring to the table. That is led off by a piece by Tracy Sayuki T. And she really defines it well. The next part is prioritization of the margins, which is what interreligious studies says it does. The margins, the boundaries between things being the fertile ground, the place where uniqueness pops up. So there are some chapters that explore that, how that would work. A whole section on interreligious dialogical close reading of texts, different kinds of materials. One of those is an interesting piece that really introduces to a multi-religious audience the scriptures of the Sikh faith. Sikhism is such a rich and beautiful religion about which most people know very little. And so here is almost a guide to how to, so you say you take seriously dialogical reading of texts. Here's my text. Please come with me and let me show you how beautiful it is and what you'll find therein. So she takes, this scholar, Nikki Singh, takes a dialogical and aesthetic approach to her own scripture. And so there are a number of other possibilities in there. Then we look at interreligious educational design, like how do you craft courses and curricula for this field? And we have quite a few suggestions. And then the last section, trajectories. Where is the field heading? And I argue that it's no longer an emerging field, it's an adolescent field, and it's here. It's still messy. We're still arguing about how to define the word interreligious and whether interfaith is the same thing or different. There's still a lot that's messy, but that's what adolescence is all about, isn't it? Any of us who raised teenagers could vouch for that. So these 4 chapters by noted scholars in the field, the 4th one being by my colleague Timur, really talk about, again, how did we get here, but more emphasis than in section 1. Here, the emphasis is on, and where do we need to go next? What is missing? What do we need to be thinking about as we move from here? And so those are interesting. So that's what's in here. Again, what's interesting, I had to put together a lecture on leadership a couple of weeks ago, and I thought, well, let's just see what's in the book on leadership, and that popped up in almost every section. So again, the categories are helpful, but you can bring your own categories to the book, and you'll find what you're looking for, because many categories defy being boxed into just one place.
So I'm going to add another thing to this is a direct quote from the book of David White. Perhaps this, I believe, was in your chapter. Is that right?
Probably.
I didn't mark the page down, but I think it speaks to what you just said, which is this pursuit of interreligious studies is about what is, but also what has been and what will be. And I think, I hope that projects like what we are doing in Omaha really exemplify the ability for people to explore the betweenness of in understanding the definitions, and then the process of sitting in a room with people and being in deep relationship. That brings me to the chapter that Ibu Patel wrote about civic renewal.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly IFYC and Faith Matters Network are a couple of examples in the United States that are doing this kind of work to energize a social infrastructure, to rebuild or build trust, that are both micro and macro. But tell us a little bit about what advice that you have that you've gained about civic renewal or rebuilding trust from this field.
Yeah. First of all, I want to just say that the quote from David White that you have marked is he's defining maturity. And so he's saying, this is what maturity is about, that we're, it's this process of living into a waiting future. And I do think that's what the field has done. And so what's cool about having a chapter in the book about civic renewal and about trust isn't that part of maturing? You know, when you get to the point where you are concerned about building trust and hanging on to the trust that you've built, you're at a point of maturity that you wouldn't have been if you're sort of a babe in the woods, you know, or a beginner. You might not be ready for that, but we clearly are ready for that. So I think that that what Ibu Patel's chapter does in the book is it reminds people that yes, there's a lot of academic and heady philosophical material to be processed and ideas to be put out there, but it's also extremely practical. And here is an example of how practical it is and how that would play out in real life. So that's what his chapter does. It's not the only one that does. Kevin Ministers on ecology is another one where he's talking about another not-for-profit called Interfaith, Power and Light. So what do we have here? We have the academic and also the practical, the stuff that needs to be thought about for a while and the stuff that can be put to work immediately.
Yeah. Sorry to distract. I was just putting a link in the chat for those at some point now or when we're finished today. We'd love to have your feedback, but I'm not intending for anyone to sign off right now. I would love anyone who has a question related to the topic that in the very broad topic that you would want to pose to Lucinda. You could unmute yourself or add to the chat. Any other aha moments while they're coming up with their questions?
Oh, aha moments. There are so many things in here that are interesting. I think that you know, one of the aha moments really is maybe the second chapter by Brian Pennington, where he, as you know, one of the founders of the field, I would look to him as one of the founders, is just talking about, you know, how do we think about what's already been written that this book stands on, and that was really helpful to me. So in terms of an aha moment as I'm constructing this and guiding people to write their chapters and going back and forth with authors about polishing chapters, you know, Brian's sort of giving me some grounds to stand on was super helpful. And so I certainly don't claim that my voice is the only one to define the field. I'm standing on the shoulders of many other people.
Thank you. In Jennifer Howe Peace's article, she talks about the term confirmation and the process of training students for religious leadership, not in a religious bubble or with denominational blinders, but with co-religionists from other traditions. Why is this important to the field? And
how does that even work?
How does that even work?
Her word actually is co-formation without a hyphen. She chose not to hyphenate it, but co-formation. And she talks about how many things in how collaborative her professional journey has been: co-editing, co-founding, co-teaching. And so this notion that co-formation of religious leaders is a thing made sense to her. In her case, she was working at Andover Newton's theological school at the time, and they were collaborating with Hebrew College, so a Christian school and a Jewish school collaborating. Things that were happening in that process were like a required course where all the rabbinical students and all the ministerial students had to study the same scriptures together, and so reading things like Genesis with two very different lenses, fascinating way of doing it. At HIU, at Hartford International University, we don't necessarily use the word co-formation, but it certainly is what we do. We're about 40% Muslim student body, roughly 40% Christian, a nice sized cohort of Jewish students now, a few Buddhists, at least one Hindu, some others that are not as easily defined. And they are studying leadership together. They are studying to become chaplains together. That's a kind of co-formation. And why is that important? Because you take your comfort level with listening to other people's answers to worldview questions. Like, how did we get here? Why are we here? What's the nature of humanity? Where are we going when we die? Those important questions for any kind of religious leader or teacher. You're learning your own answers from your own tradition, but you're also learning and being comfortable with hearing and perhaps even teaching the answers that come from other traditions. And I think it makes for, certainly in the field of chaplaincy, it makes for a healthier workplace.
Yeah. So I did not pre-warn you with this next question, which is a little bit dicey. I'm just going to say it before I say it. So this idea of co-creation and how we are building communities that we want to live in at a time that is as siloed and divisive politically as ever. How can we learn from these exercises of bringing religious traditions across different beliefs and lines with capital T truths? How can we assign that to our blue and red divisions that we have right now? How can we come to hear each other again?
I wish I had a really simple answer to that question. I can just tell you that I live in one of the reddest counties in the country, in Northeast Florida. And somehow I'm still here and thriving. And I think about people with whom I've had a relationship over a decade and a half. My hairdresser, friends from other contacts from other places, the kinds, just simply by patiently and quietly dropping hints, breadcrumbs about what I do for a living and who my students are. The curiosity level, I don't shove it on them, but where my hairdresser might have been really concerned for the welfare of my soul at 13 years ago, or really voicing to me animus about another religious tradition, now asks me questions, now just knows that I'll be doing things like I'm doing today, and is curious about it, supportive of me, wants me to look my best when I'm doing it. There's an attitude shift that has happened simply by being my most pleasant self in her presence, and continuing to drop little hints about my work, rather than demanding that she accept it as I might have wanted to lay it out for her those 13 years ago. That's one approach. Just continuing to stop in a conversation where things go in a direction that I'm uncomfortable with, to be willing to say, there's another way of looking at that. Might I mention that, and then fill in the blank. Having the courage to, in as pleasant a way as possible, counter a narrative that is harmful, hurtful. It's not easy. I'm not necessarily always good at it, but I keep trying. That's, I think, my best advice.
It's more important. I think my dad's motto is watch the pennies and the dollars will fall. And while I get that that's about capitalism, that it does apply to the work that we're doing, that sometimes the small pieces that we show up each day and do in our relationships will add up to measurable results. Sarah, thank you for raising your hand, please.
Yes, I'll be very brief, but when it was touched upon earlier when Lucinda was talking, and I just wanted, I'm not an academic, but I'm very much into the practical piece aspect of, all the sharing of things. I just wanted Lucinda's quick thought on, so not only when we are engaged in this work, is it, between different religions, but this process on a meta level, then it trickles down. And then when I'm with my own faith people, but then it's still messy between me and the people in my faith tradition. And so I just see that it's like soaks through and soaks out. And I just wanted a quick little speak to like the messiness, not even within, Christianity and Buddhism, but like together in your own congregation, and how beautiful that can be, the fallout from this type of efforts.
It can be messy. It can be beautiful. I mean, it happens within families too. I mean, just because you're related to each other doesn't mean you see the world the same way. And in my very large family, that's certainly the case. So there's a variety of thought on just about anything.
Yes.
I think patience, learning when to just listen and not feel compelled to correct every single opportunity that presents itself, has served me well. It's made it possible for me to enjoy where I live, and to see the beauty in my neighbors who politically or religiously think extremely differently from me. And yet I know they care about me, and I definitely care about them. And so that's best I can say is patience. Patience bears a lot of fruit if we're willing to keep plying it.
Thank you. Curtis, I think that'll be our last question.
Yeah. Can Curtis, you're muted.
Unmute.
Hi, Lucinda. Nice to see you after many years. And if I warmly remember the wedding from hell.
The wedding from hell, yeah, that was quite something.
Now, that was not exactly interreligious, but it was an inter-something occasion. Anyway, I'm interested. I'm now the chair of the Ecumenical Interfaith Commission in the Diocese of New York. And because it's New York and because it's us, do you have anything in your book that particularly has to do with conflict acknowledgement, conflict recognition, if not conflict resolution? Yeah. Because for the first time, we are having field education interns who are not Episcopalians, or probably a Jew and a Buddhist are going to be serving the commission. So I'm interested in being able to do something with them. We are in the area of conflict resolution in the year to come.
Yeah. Okay, well, just to clarify, the Wedding from Hell was the one where I was the organist and Curtis was the officiant, and the bride was an hour and a half late. And I,
She was mildly ambivalent.
Yeah, it was unbelievable, and it kept playing. We kept that blessed sound going for a really long time, waiting for the bride to show up, and eventually she did. But anyway, I used to serve on the very commission that you chair now. I chaired the Episcopal Muslim Relations Committee there within that commission for way long time, and so I'm familiar with the terrain. Yes, in the book there are a couple of chapters that deal specifically with interreligious approaches to conflict resolution. Resolution is not quite the right, but dealing with conflict, let's put it that way. So yeah, I would invite you to take a look at that. Rachel Mikva always has something to say about that, but there are others who do. The chapter on considering agonistic pluralism as a civic norm, that's about a particular kind of conflict, but I think the principles are able to be taken into other arenas as well, so that might serve you well. And then you can always just call me or set up a time. We'll just talk, because between my own processes and methods and those of my colleagues at HIU, we ought to be able to help you with some creative ideas.
Just one last thing. For 10 years, I was the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Religion and Health. And although that has much more to do with health, and so that this is a book that ought to be reviewed there. And that Lindsay Carey is the editor-in-chief. Use my name. You can find it on the web. But I would suggest, because of its international scope, this is a book that that someone on there should review for them.
I would very much like to see it reviewed there. So I will follow up with that. Thank you for that idea. Yeah, it's the book is dedicated to another journal, the Journal of Interreligious Studies, which I serve as senior editor, and I dedicated it to the team that I was inserted into a few years ago, and the team that founded it. It's just without these kinds of journals, we don't have. Have fewer exchanges of ideas, and these online journals are really a very fruitful place for ideas. So it'll get reviewed somehow there. I hope it gets reviewed in a few other places too. And thank you very much for the idea.
Thank you, Lucinda. Happy birthday again. I hope you have a beautiful next circle around the sun. And thank you all for joining us today. And we'll hope to see you again soon.
Yeah, thank you all for coming. This is an honor for me. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.